Yes, thank you very much. I'm just uploading my PowerPoint, and I hope everyone can see it.
I can, yes.
Okay, you can. Okay, then we can actually start it. Okay. So I would like to talk about early modernism in folk horror today. But first of all, I will introduce the concept of early modernism before I look at how the 17th century is represented in folk horror films and how the aesthetics of folk horror has been shaped by early modernism too. So, what is early modernism? Many of you will probably be familiar with the term medievalism, defined by Louis Darsens as, quote, the reception, interpretation, or recreation of the European Middle Ages in post-medieval cultures. Unquote. Medievalism has spawned a large number of studies in the last decades and has become a popular field of research. The same does not apply to the early modern period, that is the period roughly from 1500 to 1800. This is why Marina Gersic and Aidan Norrie have raised the question, quote, why is there not an equivalent term like medievalism for early modern historical and cultural afterlives? Unquote. Indeed, the term early modernism as a concept was first put forward by them in 2019, not even 3 years ago, in the introduction to the edited collection From Medievalism to Early Modernism. This can be explained by the fact that the early modern period is just not as established in the popular imagination as the Middle Ages. Corresponding to the concept of medievalism, Gersic and Norrie define early modernism, quote, as the reception, interpretation, or recreation of the early modern period in post-early modern cultures, unquote. As they also point out, the term is spelled with a hyphen, quote, to avoid confusion with the already existing term modernism, unquote. And it is indeed not the easiest term to look for in databases, as I had to find out. The interpretation and recreation of the early modern period happens in various forms across different types of media. Book, film, and TV adaptations of the Tudor period spring to mind immediately. Just think of the many portrayals of Elizabeth I or Henry VIII. But we also find forms of early modernism in real-life reenactments of the English Civil War, or even in video games such as The Witcher 3, which adapts the setting of early modern chivalric romances. Up to now, there have not been many studies of forms of early modernism, and a few studies looking at adaptations of the early modern period mainly deal with films and Shakespeare. But not much beyond that. Investigating forms of early modernism does not mean to judge how faithfully the period has been adapted, but it tells us much more about us and our time. In this way, investigating early modernism can serve, in the words of Betty Ford and Deborah C. Mitchell, as, quote, a barometer that measures our own value and place in the world, unquote. The early modern period spans 3 centuries, but with regard to folk horror, I will focus on the long 17th century, which is one of the preferred settings of folk horror. The long 17th century was a time in which belief in magic, hermeticism, and witchcraft coexisted with developing fields of natural philosophy and science, which we call today the scientific revolution. This period also saw political and religious conflicts such as the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War, as well as the establishment of European nations as colonial powers. Moreover, it was a time of colliding notions regarding a new sense of individualism and traditional obligations, which was reflected in changing practices of various folk customs. Many of the folk customs that folk horror films like to portray as ancient and unchanging only developed in the early modern period, interestingly enough. Folk horror films such as Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, The Witch, or A Field in England, that are all set within this period, don't strive for historical accuracy, and even films like Witchfinder General and A Field in England, which are set in the English Civil War, don't particularly focus on it. The English Civil War only forms a backdrop to narratives that take place at the margins of great political and historical events. Instead, these films often emphasize the discourse associated with Renaissance magic and witchcraft. I argue that folk horror films particularly adapt the notions of witchcraft and magic as they were disseminated in 17th century pamphlets and broadsides. An early modern pamphlet is a short book in quarto format, so quite a small book, comprising between 8 and 96 pages. A broadside, by contrast, is only one sheet of paper that often featured songs or ballads in printed form. Early modern pamphlets featured a great range of subjects, from political debates, astrological forecasts, prophecies, ghost stories, to tales about witchcraft, and much, much more. What they all have in common, however, is their attempt to amplify a certain message to the public, often in highly sensationalist or spectacular form. Either they wanted to convince their audience of certain political stances, as for example during the English Civil War, or they wanted to announce the end of the world, as many early modern pamphlets actually did, or just spread sensationalist news of supernatural occurrences. Since many pamphlets were illustrated with suggestive woodcuts, they also appealed to an illiterate audience, as you can see in the examples on the slide. And also in the by now famous example from 1647, The Discovery of Witches by Matthew Hopkins. Frequently, pamphlets reported on strange local events, such as ghostly apparitions or certain witch trials. This sensationalist and particularly regional approach to supernatural topics makes these early modern pamphlets a fitting source for folk horror that deals with such events in rural communities. And we have to keep in mind that these sensationalist pamphlets resemble present-day tabloids, or even some social media posts in some respect, since they are not based on fact, but pure spectacle. So just imagine if future generations were to shoot a film on the early 21st century, based purely on how this period appeared in tabloid stories or on social media posts, and you can easily imagine how history can be obscured in this way. But why is the long 17th century such a popular setting in folk horror? The genre of folk horror seems to thrive particularly at times of uncertainty and social change. Witchfinder General and Blood on Satan's Claw were produced during a time of social change in Britain when a younger generation rebelled against so-called traditional values. The folk horror revival in recent years happened against the backdrop of events such as the credit crunch and the vote for Brexit. Consequently, the unease created by these unsettling times is aptly epitomized by drawing on the memory of the English Civil War, for example, in which the traditional order had been violently abolished and England descended into chaos. 17th century pamphlets frequently reflect these anxieties as well as the horrible violence in the face of war and religious strife by blaming witchcraft or the devil for unfortunate events, or by even proclaiming catastrophes and the end of the world. By recreating this violence and anxieties, folk horror addresses issues of impending crisis, uncertainty, and fear of the future. Another reason why it is worthy to look at early modernism in folk horror is its different purpose if we compare it with, for example, forms of medievalism. The Victorians, for example, in the 19th century, employed medievalism to celebrate a romanticized pre-industrial age in which things appeared more uncomplicated, more orderly, in which everything was still slower, and in which members of a tightly knit community still knew their place in the world. The Victorians thus recreated the good old days, as they imagined them to be in the Middle Ages. By contrast, folk horror films recreate a version of the 17th century in which things were actually worse than in historical reality. Yes, there were witch trials in early modern England, but significantly fewer than on the European continent. Yes, there were many violent acts being committed in ongoing wars, but in 17th century pamphlets we find an added level of supernatural violence too, as you can see in the examples on the slide. In Blood on Satan's Claw, there is actually the devil who conjures up evil within the community, and in The Witch, there appears to be more to witchcraft in existence than we would assume to be possible. By recreating such a horrific and sometimes even supernatural past, folk horror films have a curious effect. They relieve us to some extent from our present-day fears, because everything could be much worse if we compare it to this kind of past. But there is a parallel with Victorian medievalism after all. Since in many, but not all, folk horror films set in the long 17th century, evil can be blamed on supernatural forces. This evil can somehow be exorcised in the end. Our present-day crisis can't just be exorcised in that way. In this way, early modernism in folk horror equally points to more simplistic ways of coping with crisis. Personally, I'm still waiting for a folk horror film set against the plague to mirror our most current fears at the moment. I would also like to briefly look at early modernism in the aesthetics of folk horror. Not only does the 17th century serve as a setting for folk horror narratives, but has also influenced the way how folk horror looks. And again, early modernism in folk horror is based on 17th century print culture and especially pamphlets. One of the obvious examples is the design for Robert Eggers' film The Witch from 2015. The design of the film's title and some of its movie posters is heavily influenced by the pamphlet called A Most Certain, Strange and True Discovery of a Witch, which you can see on the left. Eggers' film meticulously employs the Roman typeface of the 17th century print too, as you can see on the right side. And here is another example of how Roman typeface actually looked in 17th century print. And on the right side, you can also see how Roman typeface looks in italics. And if we compare it then again to Robert Eggers' The Witch, it's exactly the font design he's also using, as you can see in this image. Another example is from a field in England that appears to reimagine 17th century woodcuts in some of its tableau scenes, as you can see in this example here. As Michael Durant has pointed out, in various scenes of the film, the protagonist's hand form a manucle, the typographic mark frequently found on the margins of early modern printed books. You can also see it here, a manucle on the top of the slide. So actually, this is quite a nice nod to early modern print culture, which appears frequently actually in a field in England. I would also briefly like to point out the movie posters for Fanny Lie Delivered, another film set against the English Civil War. In the British movie poster, the film's title, the font of the film's title is reminiscent of 17th century handwriting in this case, here on the left side. But if you look at the German DVD cover, you can see that the feature has not been adapted by German distributors. They went for a font that somehow looks vaguely old, but it doesn't resemble 17th century printed fonts or handwriting in any way. This is a good point in case how genre knowledge can be important for marketing too, for example. It is easy to see why folk horror films set within the 17th century would adopt this design, but one of the interesting developments in folk horror of recent years is that this form of early modernism has spread beyond the narrative. Due to the limited time, I can only give a few examples, but I would like to mention the art of Richard Wells here. He designed, among many other things, supposedly early modern set pieces that are used in folk horror films such as Ben Wheatley's In the Earth from last year, and hence has significantly added to the early modernism in folk horror. Moreover, he created alternative movie posters for The Wicker Man, a film that is not set in the early modern period, for example, as well as for In the Earth, which also has a present-day setting. You can also see a similar design, for example, in his Damnable Tales, a folk horror anthology, which also features illustrations in this woodcut style, and also features again the Roman typeface of the 17th century. And his next project is an illustrated version of a novelization of Blood on Satan's Claw, and again its cover also channels the aesthetics of an early modern pamphlet again. The Roman typeface of the 17th century print has become the default design choice in folk horror, and we can also find it, for example, on the cover of Adam Scoville's folk horror book, so even in secondary literature. And we can also find it, for example, in here, folk horror revival field studies employs the same font, so to speak. And we can also find it in many of the more recent various fanzines that have sprung up. Only to give one example, here we have Rituals and Declarations, also employing this kind of font that is reminiscent of 17th century Roman typeface. But this form of early modernism even spreads to merchandise aimed at folk horror fans. So early modern woodcuts can now be appealing topics for example, here, tea towel, again with the pamphlet of the Witchfinder General. And of course, you can also, if you like by now, you can send jolly postcards with lawn mowing devils, also appealing to fans of folk horror. And these are just a few examples, of course. But what all these examples show is that the long 17th century is repeatedly reimagined and recreated to evoke the atmosphere of folk horror. This form of early modernism is by now inextricably linked to the aesthetics of folk horror, and it can be acknowledged that early modernism in folk horror has by now almost become as ubiquitous as portrayals of Elizabeth I in popular culture. Thank you.